At 14:23 local time, a Ukrainian Su-27 flew 60 meters above a river valley toward a Russian-controlled dam. Taking out this dam was crucial to disrupt Russian supply lines and reinforcement routes to the front. The flight had been routine until everything changed in an instant. The Ukrainian pilot's radar warning receiver screamed with the harsh, continuous tone that meant one thing: missile in the air. The pilot had maybe 18 seconds before a missile would detonate next to his aircraft. He slammed the stick right and pulled 7 Gs into the narrowest part of the valley. The missile was already descending from 8,000 meters on its ballistic arc. In 14 seconds, it would go active. In 16 seconds, it would be directly above him. The pilot pushed negative Gs and dove toward the river surface using every meter of terrain masking available. Water spray kicked up as the jet bottomed out at 40 meters. The radar warning receiver showed a second launch, then a third. The book battery was firing. Everything they had at the narrow valley exit where they calculated the jet would appear. But they'd made one critical error. They were firing at where the Su-27 should be, not where it was. That's because the 9M317 missile uses something called a two-stage guidance system. For the first 80% of its flight, the missile flies on pure inertial navigation toward a predicted point in space. The ground radar sends course corrections every 0.5 seconds, but those corrections are based on radar track quality. When track quality is below 60%, the corrections become guesses, and when an Su-27 is pulling 7 Gs at 40 meters altitude behind terrain, track quality drops to about 15%. This is where the Su-27's thrust-to-weight ratio of 1.09 became critical. Unlike older Soviet fighters, this jet could sustain those 7G turns without losing energy. The pilot rolled, inverted, pulled through a split S that took him down to 20 meters, then immediately reversed into a climbing barrel roll that peaked at 300 meters. Each maneuver forced the missiles to recalculate their intercept geometry. Then the first missile seeker went active. The pilot had 3 seconds. He rolled the aircraft 120 degrees right and pulled into the tributary valley that branched north. The missile seeker cone swept through empty air where the jet should have been. Without a target, it defaulted to impact fusing and detonated 400 meters behind the aircraft. The second and third missiles suffered the same fate. Their seekers couldn't find the jet through the terrain. By the time the fourth missile arrived, the Su-27 was 6 kilometers away and accelerating. The book battery had emptied a full launcher for nothing. The Russian operators weren't done, though. They had a second launcher 3 kilometers south, and this one had a better angle on the valley. The fire control radar locked onto the Su-27 as it crossed a 2-kilometer gap between ridge lines. Track quality jumped to 75%, good enough for a high-confidence shot, but there was something the book crew didn't know about the Su-27's defense systems. The jet carried an L-150 Pastel radar warning receiver that didn't just detect threats, it could analyze them. The system measured the pulse repetition frequency, scan pattern, and signal strength of the book's radar. From this, it calculated the battery's location within 200 meters. The pilot knew exactly where the missiles would come from. The only question was whether he could get out of the way in time. The Su-27's wing loading of 371 kilograms per square meter meant it couldn't turn as tightly as lighter fighters. At low altitude, the jet needed almost 800 meters to complete a 180-degree turn at combat speed. But it could do something else: climb like a rocket. With a maximum climb rate of 45,000 feet per minute, the Su-27 could gain 9,000 feet of altitude in about 12 seconds. That's exactly what the pilot did. As the book launched 2 more missiles, he pulled the stick back and firewalled the throttles. The aircraft rocketed upward at 70 degrees nose high. The AL-31F engines, each producing 2,500 pounds of thrust, drove the jet through 2,500 meters in 15 seconds. This put the aircraft above the book's optimum engagement envelope for a low-altitude target. This matters because the 9M317 missile is optimized for targets below 15,000 meters. When a target suddenly climbs from 60 to 1,500 meters in the terminal phase, the missile's control surfaces can't generate enough force to match the climb rate. The missile tries to lead the target but overshoots because its predictive algorithm assumes normal flight behavior, not a zoom climb at 300 meters per second. Both missiles passed below the Su-27. Their proximity fuses detected the jet but calculated the miss distance as too great for an effective engagement. They detonated harmlessly 200 meters below the aircraft. But the zoom climb had exposed the Su-27 to every radar within 100 kilometers. The pilot had traded one threat for another. As he pushed over at 1,600 meters and dove back toward the deck to resume his low-level flight toward the dam, a new warning appeared on the threat display. A Russian A-50 Mainstay had been orbiting 95 kilometers southeast of the dam at 10,000 meters altitude for the past 3 hours. Its Schmelm radar system could track 300 targets simultaneously out to 650 kilometers for high-altitude bombers or 215 kilometers for low-flying fighters. But the Su-27 hugging the river valley wasn't showing up as a clean track, just intermittent radar returns that appeared and vanished every few seconds. The A-50's radar operator noticed a pattern. Every 20 to 30 seconds, something was disturbing the radar picture. The disturbances lasted 1 to 2 seconds each, too brief to classify, but they were moving east at roughly 650 kilometers per hour. After correlating 12 of these ghost contacts, the computer calculated a 78% probability of a low-level penetrator following the river network. This is where the A-50 earned its keep. The aircraft's mission systems operator transmitted a Link 16 data link message to the nearest Russian fighter, an Su-35 flying combat air patrol 34 kilometers from the suspected contact. The message contained bearing, estimated speed, altitude band, and predicted intercept geometry. Within 1.7 seconds, this data appeared on the Su-35's multifunction display as a target cue box. The Su-35 pilot pushed his twin AL-41F-1S engines to military power, each producing 31,900 pounds of thrust, and turned toward the intercept vector. Without the A-50's cueing, he would have needed to search thousands of cubic kilometers of airspace with his Irbis-E radar. With it, he could focus all 20 kilowatts of radar power on a 10-kilometer wide slice of terrain where the target had to be. The Su-35 pilot selected 2 R-77 missiles hanging under his wings and checked the engagement parameters. Target altitude 400 meters and descending. Target speed 780 kilometers per hour. Target aspect 40 degrees off nose. Range 35 kilometers. This was nearly perfect geometry for a beyond visual range intercept. But here's what made this engagement more deadly for the Su-27 than the Buck launches. The R-77 has a much more sophisticated seeker than the 9M317. It uses an active electronically scanned array inside its nose that can track targets through 120 degrees off bore sight. Once launched, it doesn't need continuous updates from the launching aircraft. After flying 2/3 of the distance on inertial navigation, it goes autonomous and hunts the target on its own. The Ukrainian pilot saw the missile launch warning and knew he had about 50 seconds before the R-77 went active. That gave him time for exactly one defensive move. He pushed the throttles to full military power and accelerated to 920 kilometers per hour while descending to 30 meters above the river. At this speed and altitude, the Su-27 was riding the edge of its flight envelope. Any sudden maneuver could result in a high-speed stall or ground impact. The R-77 plunged toward the river valley at Mach 2.8. Its seeker would activate in 20 seconds. The Ukrainian pilot waited until the last possible moment, then executed a maneuver that would have been impossible in any other fighter. He pulled 9.5 Gs while simultaneously rolling inverted, using the Su-27's exceptional thrust-to-weight ratio to maintain energy through the turn. The aircraft's flight control system prevented a stall despite pulling 15 degrees angle of attack at 30 meters altitude. The missile seeker activated just as the Su-27 disappeared behind a ridgeline. The R-77 seeker went active and immediately faced a problem. Instead of open sky, it saw a wall of terrain returns. The Su-27 had disappeared behind a 500-meter ridge just as the seeker activated, leaving the missile blind at the critical moment. The weapon's logic computer had to make a decision: fly over the ridge and try to reacquire, or predict the target's path and detonate based on last known trajectory. The missile chose option 1. It pulled up to clear the terrain, adding 3 seconds to its flight time. Those 3 seconds changed everything. When the R-77 crested the ridge, the Su-27 had already turned 90 degrees and was accelerating down a perpendicular valley. The seeker swept its 120-degree field of view but found nothing. The missile had 2 seconds of fuel remaining. With no target in sight, the R-77 defaulted to its backup logic. It calculated where the Su-27 should have been based on last known velocity and heading, then detonated its 22-kilogram warhead at that position. The explosion sent 4,000 tungsten fragments spreading in a 30-meter radius. But the Su-27 was 800 meters away, heading in a completely different direction. The Russian Su-35 pilot immediately launched his second R-77, but this time the geometry was worse. The Su-27 had opened the range to 42 kilometers and was weaving between valleys. The Airbus E kept losing lock as the target disappeared behind terrain features. The Su-35 pilot knew the second shot was a long shot, but doctrine demanded he empty his missiles while he had any chance at all. The second missile went through the same sequence: inertial flight, seeker activation, target gone. It detonated 600 meters from the Su-27's actual position. The Su-35 pilot considered pursuit but checked his fuel. He'd been airborne for 90 minutes and had 2,800 kilograms remaining. Enough for 20 minutes at cruise or 8 minutes at combat power. Not enough to chase a target through valleys 180 kilometers from base. But the Ukrainian pilot hadn't come this far just to survive. Tucked beneath the Su-27's wing was the real purpose of this mission, a GBU-38 JDAM-ER. Its wings folded flat against the bomb body, waiting for release altitude. Even while evading missiles, the pilot had been running the pre-launch sequence. If you could see inside the cockpit, you'd watch him flip the master arm switch, from safe to arm, sending power to the weapon for the first time. The JDAM's internal GPS receiver immediately began searching for satellites. Its antenna acquired signals through the aircraft's skin. Within 8 seconds, the bomb had locked onto 6 satellites and calculated its own position to within 3 meters. Next, the guidance computer compared that position against the target coordinates uploaded before takeoff, the exact GPS grid of the dam's spillway joint. On the pilot's display, the weapon status changed from not ready to ready. The bomb knew where it was, it knew where the target was. Now it just needed altitude. The JDAM-ER's extended range wings could glide 40 kilometers, but only from 3,000 meters or higher. The pilot was at 1,600 meters and climbing. The dam was waiting, but something else had found him first. At 2,400 meters altitude, the JDAM-ER carried under his wing showed the first signs of trouble. The signal strength from GPS Satellite 12 dropped from negative 130 decibels milliwatts to negative 142, then disappeared entirely. Within 30 seconds, the receiver had gone from tracking 8 satellites to tracking 3, and those 3 showed position errors of plus or minus 200 meters. Way too much error for the target, and it was all because of this system. The Russian JDAM R-330ZH system protecting the dam wasn't just broadcasting noise. It was transmitting carefully crafted false signals that looked exactly like real GPS satellites, but with corrupted timing data. When a GPS receiver tries to calculate position, it needs precise timestamps from at least 4 satellites. If even one timestamp is off by 1/1,000,000th of a second, the position error becomes 300 meters. But here's what the Russians didn't know. The Ukrainian Su-27 had been modified with something called selective availability anti-spoofing modules. These modules compared GPS signals against an encrypted military code that civilian jammers couldn't replicate. While the JDAM's commercial receiver was getting confused, the military receiver maintained lock on 4 authenticated satellites. The pilot watched both displays. The JDAM thought it was 400 meters north of its actual position, but the military receiver knew exactly where they were. The question was whether the JDAM would accept a position update this late in the mission. The bomb software had been written to reject large position changes after release to prevent spoofing, but it would accept one final update just before launch if the pilot entered the right code. As the aircraft reached 2,900 meters, the GPS jamming intensified. The JDAM system had detected the aircraft's emissions and focused all 4 of its antenna arrays on the approaching threat. The jamming power increased from 100 watts to 500 watts, completely overwhelming the JDAM's receiver. But the pilot had anticipated this. He'd been flying a specific profile that would put him in a narrow gap in the jamming coverage at exactly 3,000 meters altitude. This gap existed because the JDAM's antennas were optimized for low-altitude coverage. Above 3,000 meters, the jamming pattern had a null zone that lasted about 10 seconds as aircraft flew through it. The pilot had been counting on this gap. As the altimeter touched 3,000 meters, the military GPS receiver suddenly showed 8 satellites locked with position accuracy of 3 meters. The pilot entered the authorization code. The JDAM accepted the position update. He pressed the pickle button. The bomb released cleanly and deployed its wings. In 4 minutes and 12 seconds, it would either hit the dam's critical structure joint or miss entirely. The moment the JDAM-ER cleared the pylon, a mechanical sequence began that would determine whether the bomb reached its target. If you could watch in slow motion, you'd see the 4 wing panels, 2 per side, folded flat in recessed channels along the bomb's body. As the weapon fell away from the aircraft, spring-loaded, actuators fired simultaneously, driving wings outward on hinged arms. Each panel rotated 90 degrees from stowed to deployed in 0.3 of a second. Locking pins snapped into place, making the wing assembly rigid. The tail fins deployed the same way, folded flat during carriage, then springing open to give the guidance system control authority. Within half a second of release,